Hi everybody, this is AJ speaking. Today I wanted to talk about the economics of Cybercab, and I wanted to use an intuitive example of how we can understand it by comparing Cybercab gross profitability with gross profitability of vehicle sales. Or put simply, how many Cybercabs do you have to sell to make up for one vehicle sale? But before we dive into the analysis, let's first have a look at Tesla's P&L, or another term is income statement, or as Tesla calls it, consolidated statements of operations. And I highlighted the relevant line here in red, gross profit. So gross profit is the residual after you deduct from the revenue the cost of the revenue. I'd like to point out this is before you paid for R&D expenses, selling, general and administrative expenses, and other expenses called operating expenses. However, as a product is up and running and is being sold, R&D expenses for an ongoing product are minimal. For example, the Model Y, the outgoing Model Y incurred very little R&D expense, obviously. R&D expense was almost exclusively focused, or probably entirely focused, on the new Model Y. The same is true for selling, general administrative expenses, although there is some scaling with increased vehicle sales, and there will be some, let's call it overhead from Cybercab. This should be also minimal because the primary cost for Cybercab will be in the cost of revenue. So the gross profit number already takes into account the vast majority of any Cybercab sales. Cybercab revenue. So the bottom line of this is that gross profit is a really good proxy for how much profit the Cybercab will generate. To come up with a reasonable Cybercab gross profit estimate, we need to talk about some key assumptions. A very important assumption for any type of taxi ride-hailing service is always how many miles have been driven with customers on board. Due to driving to customers to pick them up, returning to a depot, going perhaps to a charging place, and various other reasons why a Cybercab might drive without any paying customer on board, we need to have an assumption for how many empty miles, let's call it idle miles, or the industry term is deadheading miles, will be driven with Cybercab. In this analysis, I've been using 60%. In other words, 40% of all miles driven will be without any paying customers. So only for 60% of total miles driven, Tesla actually earns revenue. And for example, in New York City, the average is 67%, but New York City has quite a high utilization rate because it's a very high density city. The utilization rate can drop significantly below 40%, and there are various sources. So one source I've used was the UITP. For example, if you look at this chart, you see the problem. Here on the far right is New York City, and I added here these lines to make it clearer to see. You can see that at New York City, the occupancy rate is about 67% and is amongst the highest. There are various other cities that are, I think, for North America, less relevant, especially for the United States, but we can look at least at Montreal. Montreal has below 40% occupancy, and the reason is Montreal is a quite outspread city and with relatively low density. However, 60% is in our case, which is very US focused, likely a quite workable assumption. The next assumption that we need is the average speed of the vehicle. And in this example, I'm using 30 miles per hour. And here I'd like to point out this varies significantly from city to city, but also from the time of the day. For example, in New York City, this can drop significantly below 30 miles per hour. And in low traffic situations, this can go in other cities significantly above 40 miles per hour. And just as a side note, when I refer to cities, I refer exclusively to the top 20 cities in the United States. I'll get to in a second why we need the average speed assumption. On average operating cost per mile driven, we take Elon's comment. So Elon stated operating cost is probably going to be around 20 cents a mile. And Elon also gave us a price assumption. He said price including taxes and everything else probably ends up being 30 or 40 cents a mile. And here's a very important note. Because of the occupancy rate, which is often which is never 100% and often near 60 or sometimes, as we earlier discussed, even below 50%. I think when Elon talks about the 20 cents cost per mile and the price that can be charged at 30 to 40 cents, he must mean that the 20% pertains to the chargeable mile, because if this assumption was not correct, robotaxis would not generate profits. If you would spend 20 cents per mile driven, so on all the miles, whether there's a customer or not in the vehicle, and you only charge 30 cents, given the low occupancy, you could not make any gross profit. It would be highly loss-making. For this reason, it's highly unlikely Elon meant that every mile driven incurs 20 cents. And for that reason, I think what he really meant was, and this also makes sense, that he was referring for the cost per mile in relation to the price charged, so the chargeable miles driven. It's a very important distinction here. Next, we need to understand how many hours the vehicle is being used. And in a second, it will make sense why we need the average city driving speed assumption. And here we also use a comment Elon made. Elon said, my rough estimate is that it is in use for at least a third of the hours per week. So call it 50, maybe 55 hours per week. So in this analysis, I've been using 50 hours. However, there is a, let's call it second use case at night when there's very low demand for, I'm talking very late at night in the early morning hours, when there's very little demand for robotaxis. A second use case could be that Tesla starts a kind of a delivery service and uses the huge fleet that will be available at night to basically move parcels, etc. However, this second use case has not been included in the economics of this analysis. So next, with the average speed assumption and total, we can now estimate total miles. And based on average speed of 30 miles per hour and 50 hours usage, we arrive at 1,500 miles driven per week. On a daily basis, this would be 214 miles. And this is total miles driven. This is not chargeable miles. So in the next step, we need to account for the idle miles or deadheading miles. So the chargeable miles, based on these assumptions, will be 900 per week or 129 miles per day. And then this also means that the robotaxi will be driving 600 miles per week, basically empty, or 86 miles empty per day. But as pointed out earlier, this will vary significantly from city to city based on density and also duration of rush hour traffic, etc. Then we can get to the sort of the dollar impact of all of this. First, we can calculate the cost. We know Elon's 20 cents per mile, plus the chargeable miles per week. We can work out the cost per week of the vehicle is $180, and the revenue will be $360 per week. Let me just unhide this. Now we can go to the gross profit for the first time. We just subtract from the revenue the cost. So we get to $180 of gross profit over a 1 week period. This translates into a monthly rate of $71, and per quarter, assuming 91 days, a gross profit of $2,340. And now comes the next important step. As I said in the beginning, I wanted to translate this number into something that is more, let's call it tangible, or is more understood with other Tesla metrics. And one key metric of Tesla is always the deliveries numbers per quarter. And for that reason, we need to look at the average gross profit per vehicle that is generated based on an outright sale but also including leasing and also credits. So basically the fully loaded gross profit from a vehicle sale in Tesla's case was in 4Q 2024 $6,635. This means one Cybercab in full operation for 1 quarter duration amounts to about 35% of one vehicle sale fully loaded. But keep in mind, the Cybercab is not only operational for one quarter. It will be operational for several quarters, and that's why there's a recurring gross profit stream, and that's the key difference, and something we will sort of illustrate in the next step. And if we kind of conceptualize that, down here you see the Cybercab's mileage in 1 year. So after 52 weeks, it will be driving 78,000 miles, and after 4 years that would be 312,000 miles. Now the question is, will a Cybercab last that long? It's debatable, but when you look into the taxi industry, and depending on country, etc., there are quite a few taxis that have that kind of mileage, and sometimes significantly more. And given it's an electric vehicle that has been designed from the ground up for high utilization, etc., unlike taxis are just regular cars that are being used for taxi service but have never been designed for taxi service. It appears reasonable that a 4-year lifespan for a Cybercab doesn't appear unrealistic, especially given that the OEM Tesla does all the maintenance. The vehicle is full with sensors. We know it, so Tesla can do, let's call it preemptive maintenance, and make sure the vehicle is in good condition. So with that, we can look at the gross profit emergence. And in this calculation, I'm just using the following example. So first there are vehicle sales and there are Cybercabs. And we assume for both, each quarter, Tesla sells 50,000 vehicles, every quarter 50,000, and here's the average gross profit for each vehicle sale, and this is the gross profit that you saw earlier, but I apply an inflation adjustment because this projection is for several years, and every time you go over several years, you should always take into account inflation, because it's unreasonable that vehicle prices stay the same for the next 4 years, and that's why gross profit, etc., should at least inflate. That makes complete sense. And for the Cybercab, we do the same. We assume the same 50,000 vehicles, but instead of being sold, they are being launched. So this is the key delta. So Tesla generates, in this example, every quarter gross profit from 50,000 vehicle sales. So it stays the same. So the revenue per quarter is $332 million. And it's every quarter the same, of course, because the amount doesn't change, and the gross profit only changes with the inflation, so there's barely any change. And I just noticed I have here a mistake in the formula. Let me just fix that real quick. Okay, sorry for that. So now you have the quarterly revenue grows with the inflation rate. And then we look at the Cybercabs. So 50,000 vehicles, 100,000, 150. So the fleet of Cybercabs is growing every quarter by 50,000 vehicles. And the gross profit, the same story. We apply the same 2% per annum inflation adjustment. And let me just check so this formula is correct. And you can see how initially the quarterly revenue from launching Cybercabs is significantly less. It's let's call it roughly 1/3, and then when we compare the cumulative, so if you add up all the quarters revenue as they occur, you can see that the Cybercab the gross profit is significantly less than the gross profit of the vehicle sale, but after about 4 quarters, that changes and then quickly turns into the favor of this Cybercab, i.e. Cybercab generates a lot more gross profit. And here's another key consideration. So this example is for 4 years, and the reason why it's for 4 years is it's the assumed life expectancy of a Cybercab. And here's a big piece that is often missed. So you start selling Cybercab here, and after 4 years, the first cohort of Cybercab sales leaves the fleet. So this example just tries to compare apples and apples, and that's why we can't include additional Cybercab sales here or launches here, and that's why the fleet you see accumulates to 800,000 vehicles and then decumulates and runs down. And after 4 years, basically here after 4 years, fourth quarter, you have the last 50,000 vehicles being launched, and they also age and they also leave the fleet. So in this apples to apples fleet comparison, you can see that the Cybercab fleet of the initial first 4 years is gone after 4 years, obviously, and you see the total gross profit emergence of that Cybercab fleet of this is $32 billion, and this is almost 6 times more than selling the same number of vehicles outright to customers. So after these 4 years, it's 800,000 vehicles sold, it's 800,000 Cybercabs launched, but the lifetime gross profit generation is almost 6 times larger. Here it's 5.86 times under these assumptions. And now we break it down into something that is more easily understood. So these 800,000 Cybercab launches, they are the equivalent of selling 4.7 million vehicles directly to customers. So this is the key observation here. So every Cybercab sale is basically almost 6 times as valuable in terms of gross profit generation. However, what you have to keep in mind, it takes a few years for the gross profit to emerge. But after about 1 year, you can see that Cybercab sales become much more profitable than just selling vehicles outright to customers. And down here in this graph, the gross profit emergence visualized, you can see what I pointed out earlier in the beginning. So this purple line is Cybercab, and this dark blue line is just vehicle sales. You can see that in the beginning, the dark blue line is higher, slightly higher than the Cybercab gross profit emergence, but then quickly after about 1 year, this changes, and then Cybercab significantly outperform vehicle sales and reach a much higher endpoint. And here you can see that in this example, based on these assumptions, to make it apples to apples, the gross profit stays basically constant at just over 5 billion, while the Cybercab reaches over, in this example, 32 billion. And I'd like to point out what I mentioned earlier. This assumes single use. So this is just ride-hailing, moving people around. But you can easily imagine that this large fleet of vehicles can be used for all kinds of other things. Just like in the airline industry, it's very common that passenger airliners are being converted basically overnight to transport cargo. And something very similar can be done with basically a meaningful share of Cybercabs. So in summary, Cybercab gross profit generation likely 6 times higher than a comparable vehicle sale. And for this reason, this will be a very material opportunity. It will take a few quarters to have a very substantial gross profit impact, but keep in mind, this obviously depends on how quickly Tesla launches Cybercabs, and you've seen this example. I've been using very conservative numbers. I've only used 50,000 quarterly vehicle sales. Given the simplicity of the vehicle, likely one line could make more than 50,000 vehicles once ramped of this type of vehicle. With that, I hope it was useful. See you next one. Bye.